Hello readers, welcome back to PJL Books and welcome to today's Off the Shelf. Today we finish our mini-series on Antagonists with part 4, Power. So, we've talked about the types of antagonists, how to make them meaningful and well-rounded, and how to make them understandable without being sympathetic. With that, you'd think we're all set to create the ultimate antagonist, right? Well, not yet. There's still one more thing to bear in mind. The fact that they shouldn't be, well, ultimate. You see, so far the whole character build of the villain has been internal. In other words, creating the bad guy by thinking about the bad guy. But there is no doubting that the antagonist is defined by their relationship with the protagonist, at least in terms of how it serves the plot. The dynamic between these two forces basically defines your story. And the surest way to kill any potential tension and excitement? By making the skill, intelligence and power between the forces of good and evil completely unequal to the point of disbelief. Now there are two ways in which this can play out. When the antagonist is clearly far more powerful, smart, and all around greater than the good guy, or when the antagonist is a gibbering mess that has absolutely nothing on the good guy. Let's start with the first type. Please don't mistake this with those classic underdog stories. In all those stories, sure, the good guy may be out of his depth in a technical sense, but the gap between good and bad is not insurmountably huge. What the protagonist lacks in sheer skill, she makes up in spirit and effort. If it's a sport movie, that also means plenty of training montages. But that's the thing. After going through trials and tribulations, the protagonist finally gets into a position where they have a fighting chance. Any victory will come feeling well earned. But it's when that gap becomes too big that it ceases to be an underdog overcoming the odds and more about sheer luck and catching the all-powerful antagonist out on a fluke. The bigger the gap, the more you as the author will need to stretch to find that chink in the armour that brings down that nigh invincible villain. And because the protagonist is then put in a position where they have to work to exploit a weakness, such victory feels poorly earned because it's not down to the protagonist's force of will and gumption, but rather using a kind of cheat to bring down the bad guy. In fact, it can even put the protagonist in a bad light, as this whole business of stooping to find the weak point and rip the bad guy apart with it is something many feel should be beneath a protagonist with a strong moral compass. At the other end of the spectrum, there are stories where the villains are snivelling, hopeless fools who have ideas well above their station and clearly no chance to achieve it. From the get-go, it's immediately clear that the antagonist is going to fail. Indeed, you often feel that even if the protagonist were completely absent, the antagonist would fail anyway because their plans would implode on their own accord from classic reasons such as incompetent henchmen who bungle everything to simply not having the resources. It's true. I mean, how many stories have you known where the protagonist accidentally helped these antagonists out on a bank robbery or launching a missile? Of course, the problem with this approach is immediately apparent. A victory for the protagonist is clear to see from the beginning, so why should the audience bother reading or watching if there are no obstacles to overcome or tension to push against? An example that springs to mind is Mossflower by Brian Jakes. Sarmina may seem to be a wicked and intelligent foe at first, but she is thwarted time and again by nearly everyone she comes into contact with, even the lowly woodland folk. Her henchmen are beyond useless, and her lieutenant must have changed at least 5 times because they kept getting killed in the space of one book. And this leads on to another secondary problem. You see, we are hardwired to feel sorry and sympathise with those who have it tough, and dislike anyone who exacerbates that. By the end of Mossflower, I actually felt a little bit sorry for Tamina, who had to put up with a staggering level of incompetence and grief. I swear she was suffering from PTSD by the end. And on the flip side, this made the heroes, especially Martin the Warrior, seem self-righteous, pompous, and cold by comparison. So this kind of useless, bumbling antagonistic force has absolutely no advantage on the protagonist whatsoever. It is quite an old-fashioned style, which is why the modern audience may not have as many of examples of it to pull upon. I mean, Mossflower was published in 1988. The message was quite clear. Being a villain doesn't pay, it isn't fun, and it has no redeeming features whatsoever. But over time, we saw what I like to call stakes creep, which I'll elaborate on in the next Off the Shelf. This resulted in villains that are actually so insurmountable that defeating them is literally unbelievable. The simple fact is that the heroes should meet their match in the villain, not an unclimbable wall. Even if you do want to have an all-powerful antagonist, there should be at least a proxy that the heroes can be at odds with on a face-to-face basis and feel that they keep each other on their toes. In Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series, omnipresent powerful villain Lord Ruler is served by proxies in the form of Inquisitors, who aren't as powerful as the Lord Ruler, but they certainly give Kelsier, Vin, and the crew something to worry about. Protagonists and antagonists who can square up to one another and fight fair makes for a more honest and meaningful fight, and the end result more believable and satisfying. And that's it for today's Off the Shelf. Thank you very much for listening, readers. This post is on my PJL Books website, the link of which is in the description below, so if you wish to read that, please have a look. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.